We can go back to this topic at the end if anyone thinks about anything while.
Okay, I guess I'll start now. My name is Trisha, and today I'll be talking about redlining and fracking. But first we need to understand what redlining is. Could you go to the next slide? And I don't know if you can see it, but it says, there's a quote by Richard Rothstein, who's an author of The Color of Law. And it says, a state-sponsored system of segregation. He's describing redlining. Okay, so redlining is defined as the practice of denying or limiting financial services to certain neighborhoods based on racial or ethnic composition without regard to the residents' qualifications or credit worthiness. And as Fiona said earlier, this is obviously related with environmental justice because of all the factors that she described before, like based on racial or ethnic composition and without regarding their merit, I guess. So that's what redlining is. And the term comes from like the government officials would make a red line around areas on a map to specify the areas where financial institutions would not invest money. And it was a housing policy. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a map. Oh, yeah. So even after the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, which was condemning the earlier racist policies put in place by the Federal Housing Administration, the housing and city structure remained in place. Redlining is the practice of denying, oh, I already said that, but the reason why redlining had such a great impact was because it wasn't addressed for 30 years. So it started in the 1930s, and then only in 1968 was a law actually passed to prohibit the policies that redlining was based on. But even today, redlined areas not only experienced greater impact by climate change because of heat islands, and I'll post some links later to talk about what heat islands are, but I won't be covering that right now, but also because of industrial and toxic practices being held in and around these neighborhoods. You can go to the next slide, yeah. And this is a cartoon that I found on seattle.gov. And if you can see, there's a businessman drawing a line across the road. And on one side, you can see that the houses are bare and really old and not renovated. And you can see an African-American family depicted there. And on the right side of the line, there's another guy dumping money. He's a government official. And that's because they spent all their money on the white part of town. So they would have all the equity coming from, like, they would invest all their money there, and none of it would go to the African American side of town because they considered it as a dying part of the city. So next slide, yeah. Okay, and recently, I'm sure some of you guys have seen this tweet on social media. Donald Trump posted about repealing the Obama AFFH rule, and what he's implying in his first tweet, that you won't be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood, is the people of color who were integrated into white neighborhoods. So if you couldn't see it before, that's why it's so wrong what he's saying here. So next slide. Yeah, so now I'll be talking about fracking, and you can go to the next slide. So here's a quote from Richard Rothstein from his interview at NPR. And he says, in Los Angeles and St. Louis, African American residents were rezoned to permit industrial and toxic uses. Those rezonings turned those neighborhoods into slums. And this also contributes to the image that the white parts of the counties saw African Americans as because he said they thought, and if the slum dwellers, which is what the white neighborhoods saw them as, if the slum dwellers moved into their neighborhoods, into the white neighborhoods, they would bring those conditions with them. So everything contributes to the social image of minorities in America. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to talk about the impact of fracking. So according to an article by Inside Climate News, in San Antonio, Texas, a resident named Chauvel Lopez said, "We already had issues right here in San Antonio. Fuel storage tanks were all located on the east side, predominantly African American neighborhoods," he said. For some of these Hispanic neighborhoods, they were already dealing with uranium mining impacts and now the fracking of oil and gas. This reveals how fracking is closely related to historic housing policies, which outcast residential areas populated by Hispanic people and African Americans. In a study published by the American Journal of Public Health, it's found that disposal wells for fracking were 2.04 times as common in areas with 80% people of color or more than in majority white areas. The study concluded that wastewater disposal wells in southern Texas are disproportionately permitted in areas with higher proportions of people of color, and residents living in poverty, with higher proportions of people of color. This is known as environmental injustice. Another drawback that these neighborhoods face is the depletion of local water supply. So if you don't know already, the process of fracking involves pumping around 3 to 6 million gallons of water and other chemicals into the ground. And the pressure breaks shale rock beds, which are deep underground. And then the pressure allows natural gas to come in through the cracks in the shale rock and then flow back up to the surface. So in counties like Kern County, California, there are 77,497 active fracking wells. So you can see how the on local water supply really adds up. The worst part is that the wastewater that is pumped back up to the surface after the fracking process is complete, it all gets dumped in retention pools at the fracking site. Fracking fluid is made up of around 90% water, but concentrated chemicals are also added to the water. The chemicals in fracking fluid are extremely dangerous when in contact with living beings, so animals and also humans. Among other unknown effects, they're known to be carcinogenic, cause birth defects in populations whose water supply has been contaminated due to negligence by fracking companies. In short, the fluid itself can be deadly, and what makes it worse is that the flowback fluid contains radioactive contaminants, salts, heavy metals, and hydrocarbons from underground. It can't even be treated in wastewater plants. There have been many known accidents by fracking companies that have occurred as a result of their negligence and lack of being held accountable, which is where the government comes in, by the way. And last week I explained an incident in Pennsylvania which occurred in 2014, where a fracking site needed to be a fracking contractor was killed by a methane leak at his fracking site. And on top of that, the local community that was near that site needed to be evacuated immediately as a result of enormous fires and smoke. Since fracking sometimes to take natural gas from the ground, the methane that leaks is extremely harmful for both the atmosphere and the people living nearby. And it's also highly flammable. And the reason why I brought up all of these occurrences with fracking is that if you remember what I said earlier, it's more than 2 times as likely for wells to be near residential areas where it's a majority of the residents are people of color. So this also is an example of environmental injustice. That's all for my topic. If you have questions.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you think there's any way, like, and we've been talking about voting a lot, but do you think there's like any other way that like we could support these like lower income minority communities, especially when it comes to environmental justice and injustice?
I'm not really too confident on other ways, but the reason why voting is so important, and I know you said other than voting, but like still, is because fracking companies have a lot of power, especially with a president like Trump who favors business and the economy. These companies will be favored and they will be funded, and you can't really do much to take away that power unless the government starts acting. And also, I was going to restate a topic, something that I said yesterday, which is that it creates a lot of jobs, which is what fracking industry claims. But it would also create more jobs if we were to start funding renewable energy projects. And since it's way less developed than fracking companies, there would be even more jobs that are available. So I wanted to say that. And does anybody else have ideas of like what we could do other than voting? Because I'm not really sure.
I think Polly went into this a little bit yesterday, or like Friday's presentation, like last Friday's, but like supporting organizations that are working against creating environmental, like they're working for environmental groups as opposed to fracking lobbyists.